Hello and welcome to the FUTVE English Podcast in collaboration with World Football Index, a unique mix of fandom and journalism. FUTVE English is your one-stop shop for all things Venezuelan football in the English language, from the men's to the women's and the domestic leagues to the national teams. We're back for the second episode of the year, and it is the Liga FUTVE 2023 preview show. And with me, as almost always, is my co-host, Dominic. Dominic, thank you for being here, and how are you today?
I'm doing great. Really looking forward to the season kicking into action, and looking forward to talking about it today.
Well, since we did our first preview podcast for the 2021 season, so this being the third edition, quite a bit has changed. I was looking at the numbers earlier today, and we've gone down from 21 teams in the 2021 season to 15 teams for the 2023 season. So just in the space of 3 seasons, going down by 6 teams, which means around 200 professional players less playing the top flight of Venezuelan football. And at the same time, the foreigner limit has gone up from 4 per team to 6 per team. So it's been harder than ever, really, to be a professional football player in Venezuela at the top flight. And we've seen that in the window to the point where, and we're going to talk about it probably first, the point where Estudiantes, Mineros and UCV only started pre-season a week before the season started and still look like they're going to be able to put out reasonably competitive squads. Dominic, how has pre-season been in Liga FUTVE? I know you've been following it pretty closely.
It's been eventful. It's been very eventful, and it's been interesting to see many of the different clubs are taking dramatically different approaches. You have certain clubs like Metropolitanos, Rayo Zuliano, Angostura that have relied mostly on domestic friendlies. Those 3 clubs, along with Hermanos Comuneros, took part in a sort of a friendly preseason cup as well. But then you have teams like Carabobo and Monagas as well, who have relied basically on abroad trips. Monagas to Bolivia and Carabobo to Colombia, playing lots of different clubs from those respective countries, first and second division clubs. So you've seen a really wide berth of approaches to preseason, which I think is interesting. And then, of course, some more complicated preseasons for the teams that have taken a while to get going. But it's certainly been very eventful. I've been very encouraged by the clubs that have shown that sort of ambition to go abroad and get a lot of reps in against international sides. I think that's a very ambitious thing to do, and most of the clubs doing it are clubs that are going to be in international competitions this season. So it certainly makes sense for them to want to get those reps against non-Venezuelan clubs. But in general, it's been good to see some sort of preseason tournaments being held and all that sort of thing. It's been action-packed with of course some absence from Estudiantes, Mineros, and UCV, as you said, and of course Deportivo Lara as well.
And you've alluded to it there, Deportivo Lara. What has happened to them?
Yeah, it's interesting because Deportivo Lara had released encouraging statements about taking part in the season before Mineros, Estudiantes, and UCV ever did. Mm-hmm. And I think that gave people a lot of hope. And of course, what's then happened is the club are not taking part in the season at all. They are not registered for the Liga FUTVE season. A lot of what goes beyond that is half rumor, half report. But there is certainly discussion about people stepping down at the club. Various issues there. The players they had announced that they were going to sign, they put out a list of players. Many of those players are now being connected or already are signed by other teams. And so it's sort of a bizarre situation where you had a club that we were, and this was reflected in our Twitter post, for example. We were talking about Mineros, Estudiantes, and UCV as the clubs that were in trouble because Deportivo Lara had put out their new kits for the season. They had put out players, all these things. And suddenly they are the only one missing out. It's sort of a bizarre twist right before the season started. But yeah, very unfortunate. And since then, I know there's been some sort of public action by supporters of the club. And there's certainly a lot of discourse around that, a lot of mystery still about exactly why it played out that way. But the one thing that we know for sure is that Deportivo Lara are not going to be taking part in the season this year.
Yeah, and we're recording this on the Wednesday. You'll be, if you're listening to it on the day of release, you're listening to it on a Thursday. And the Liga FUTVE season starts on Friday. But we've seen today, or at least I've seen today on Twitter, that supposedly Lara, or people connected to the future of Deportivo Lara, have put in like a 10-day request to the Venezuelan Football Federation to try and sort things out. I presume and would hope for the integrity of the competition, it's too late for them to start Liga FUTVE, but it may be that they can play this season in the second division through an administrative relegation rather than miss out entirely. Lara, if you don't know, is one of the more historic clubs in Liga FUTVE. So for them to disappear entirely, even if it was just for a year, would be a knock. Because as you've written about, Dominic, they are the only top flight division they have been the only top flight club, in the first division in its entire state. So it's really, had the ability to hoover up the best talent of what is quite a sizable state. So for Lara to have no presence in the top division this season is a big knock. So hopefully they can sort things out for the at least participation in the second division. But moving on from pre-season, let's talk about the transfer window. And I find myself once more, for one reason or another, pretty curious to see how Carabobo's transfer market dealings pan out. They have signed Jeremy Vachot. Sorry for my hideous French pronunciation there, but they have signed a goalkeeper from France, last playing in the second division with over 80 caps in Ligue 2. He is going to be the first Frenchman to play in Liga FUTVE, and perhaps, I haven't checked the history, but perhaps the first Frenchman to play in Copa Libertadores, or at least the first for some time. Dominic, Carabobo once again taking our attention.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, last season, they made a lot of moves. There's a lot of changes at the club. We, of course, went quite in depth on that. And this year it continues. What's interesting about Carabobo's roster, I feel like, heading into this season is they still have actually a lot of the pieces they picked up last year in terms of sort of the back half of the pitch that garnered interest, garnered excitement. They've certainly added to that. You mentioned on the goalkeeping front, they've added some really interesting midfielders, experienced midfielders like Carlos Sosa or Francisco Flores, Mikel Covea. A lot of good players, experienced players in the league and outside of Venezuela as well. Obviously, the big question for them is, have they really found a way to replace Kevin Viveros' goals? Of course, we're talking about the Golden Boot winner from last season, who has since returned to his native country of Colombia with Deportivo Cali. So, I think the question is just whether or not they'll be able to find ways to get the goals they need. In preseason, it's worth noting that their preseason in Colombia, I mentioned earlier, has been a bit back and forth. They've had some good results, some tough draws. They've also had some big losses, although those have, to be fair, mostly been to bigger Colombian clubs. And I'm curious to see, a big loss in preseason is not really necessarily a omen of anything because it's preseason. But what I'm interested to see is when you have a club making so many changes at the far back and far front of the pitch, just how are they going to learn from those losses? How are they going to be adapting? Of course, all this while having a new manager as well. So a lot of questions, but I think we saw last year that their project was capable of putting together a very strong side. And so I certainly think there's reason to be optimistic about their ability to maintain some sort of upper table international competitive spot in Venezuelan football.
Yeah, I've got them down to qualify for Copa Sudamericana. It's actually easier for us to make those predictions this year because there has been a slight format change, which I'll go through now. Originally, it was mooted that the same format would stay in place, and it almost has. There's going to be a regular season amongst the 15 teams, everyone playing each other home and away for a total of 28 games. The top four, as last season, will then advance to a final phase, playing each other again home and away for the then top two to play in a one-off grand finale. The top two being direct qualification for Copa Libertadores group stages, third and fourth for the qualifying stages. And then, in a difference to last year, there is no final phase Sudamericana playoff. It's simply the teams that finish 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th that will qualify for the Copa Sudamericana. And then the bottom team of the whole league, so whoever finishes 15th, will play a promotion/relegation playoff against the runners-up of Liga FUTVE 2. Which means, hopefully, next season, although you can never tell with Venezuelan football, with clubs, disappearing at the last minute or having administrative relegations, it looks like the league at least intend for there to be a return to 16 teams next season, with 2 teams coming up and, one team coming up and then one team either coming up with them or the bottom place team from Venezuela winning that playoff and staying up. Moving on from Carabobo, there's a couple of teams that have had more challenging transfer windows, or at least the requirements on them being more challenging than others. And the club that springs to mind for me is Mineros. They lost Juan Camilo Zapata, Anwar Pérez, and Wilmer Aguinaga. So their Colombian trio that were responsible for the vast majority of their goals for the past 2 years. Zapata alone responsible for 50% via either goals or assists. All 3 have left. Juan Camilo Zapata to Cape Town City of South Africa in what is a club transfer record for the South African club, and by proxy, a club record transfer for Mineros as well. Anwar Pérez is still without a club. The tall Colombian striker has been in talks with a few USLC clubs, as well as a few clubs in Asia. And Wilmer Aguinaga has been poached by fellow Liga FUTVE club Academia Portuguesa. Dominic, how have they gone about replacing their predominant sources of goals?
Well, that's a good question. I think Hermanos Comuneros have certainly made signings to fill in the spaces in their roster. I guess what remains quite unclear, and the preseason did not necessarily help this, in which they performed quite mildly in the games that I watched, at least. It doesn't quite seem like there is a clear answer to that. They have made moves. They're still connected to other players. There's a sort of unresolved connection between them and Franklin Gonzalez, for example, that I know has floated around. But it's not clear to me that a clear replacement has been found for those 3. And by the way, others that left as well. I think of Figueroa, for example, another player that's left.
Figueroa went to Cida Magallanes, gone to Zamora.
Yeah, so it just, I know both of us have some question marks about their ability to climb up the table at all this season, and I'm not sure I've seen much in preseason that changes that for me. For what it's worth, this is a club that has certainly been very good at defying expectations. So I leave them the room to prove me wrong and prove themselves right yet again. But to me, it's certainly concerning when you see really the entire creative core of a club disappear, and then it's replaced by a lot of sort of unknown is perhaps harsh, but question marks, players that did not immediately sort of yell to you clear results in Liga FUTVE. And so I'm not really sure what to think about Hermanos Comuneros this season. They're kind of one of those teams that I feel like I'm not going to know what to think of until I have maybe 3 or 4 games into the season, to be frank, which might bode badly for them. But again, this is a club that has defied expectations many times, so they might figure it out.
Yeah, and for us, like putting our names to predictions either in this podcast or in the threads that we do, it's not just Hermanos Comuneros that is like causing a problem, like we touched on at the beginning. Mineros, Estudiantes, and UCV, like basically having UCV in particular having like essentially just a week to prepare, and in their case barely a roster to their name, to having to field 11 plus subs a week later. UCV seem to be filling their squad out fairly well from what I hear. I was speaking to Johnny Gonzalez, their right back, this morning. I've been playing football with him every week for the past 2 months now, so I can assure UCV fans that he is fit. I had a nice ball-sized bruise on the back of my thigh to attain to that. But they seem to be signing Achilles Acanto, who finished 5th in the Golden Boot race last season with 11 or 12 goals. He's getting on a bit now, like mid-30s, but he was a league winner, a couple seasons ago with La Guaira. Like I said, over 10 goals and a handful of assists for Monagas, who finished runners-up last season. So more than capable. They have Ronald Peña and Ronaldo Peña remaining at the club. Anya Maldonado, the 23-year-old at left wing. They signed Jose Pinto from Academia Puerto Cabello, who is a firm favourite of many a Liga FUTVE analyst, although he goes slightly under the radar. Williams Velasquez is another one that is staying. But then they've added Juan Reyes from Zamora, the goalkeeper, who had a good season last year in Barinas. And at centre-back, they've also added the likes of Jose Graterol, who you may remember for wearing his shorts rather high at Yaracoyanos a couple of seasons ago. And Hector Noguera as well from Academia Puerto Cabello. So UCV are actually looking all right, but I still expect them to be in a bottom three scrap. Looking towards the top of the table, I'm not going to ask you who you think will win the league, because I think that is always very tough, but even more so tough this year. But if you would be so brave to maybe chuck 5 or 6 names into the hat for who you think will finish top 4.
Yeah, I think we agree more or less on the 4 clubs that seem very set to compete for this, and we can go from there about maybe a couple other competitors. I think that the 4 that I think is on everybody's mind is Academia Puerto Cabello, Caracas FC, La Guaira, and Monagas. Those seem like the 4 teams that between roster strength, between coach moves, preseason, things seem to be lining up very well. There's lots of reasons for confidence. I think that Carabobo certainly have. There's reason to believe they have a chance at competing for one of those spots. I think Deportivo Táchira are a little bit of a unclear commodity at this moment, in the sense that we know they're going to be competitive. Of course, they had a very competitive season last year, but they also had a disappointing season last year. And how that translates into this year is not necessarily clear, but would not be surprised if they end up very much in the mix. And of course, you have your defending champions in Metropolitanos that have a lot of the talent they had last year, although it's unclear whether or not they'll be able to pull off, quite the level of competitiveness that they had in 2022. So I think those, I think I named 7 there. I think those 7 are sort of the ones that are on most people's minds. Those first 4 I mentioned kind of being the ones that feel the most certain to me.
Yeah, for me, I'll be brave and say I think my top 4, in no particular order. I expect the 4 to chase for the title to be Academia Puerto Cabello. It's worth pointing out they've got Noel San Vicente in charge this year. We saw what he did with Zamora last year, and let's reiterate, Erickson Gallardo and Antonio Romero aside, that was a fairly average squad, without meaning any offense to the team, but they certainly did not on paper look like a team that were, until the very final day of the season, in the top 2, and therefore would have been group stages Libertadores this season. And San Vicente has brought in some reinforcements that he knows very well. Diego Ossio and Kaki Rivero, centre-back partnership at Caracas from a couple of years ago. Sandro Nota Roberto, again from Caracas, at left-back. They brought in Kendra Silva, arguably the best right-back in the league last season, or second best behind Juan Cuesta, depending on what you like. Further forward, like I said earlier, Wilma Aguinaga's gone in from Hermanos Comuneros. They already had Alfredo Stevens and Loy Fernandez. Midway through last season, they recruited well, bringing in Jacob, African midfielder from the 2nd division of Portugal, that can play in midfield or defence. So they are going to look very strong. And then Caracas, after a disappointing 2022, have got wholesale changes to their playing staff and coaching staff, and are boosted by the return of Richard Celis, who got 17 goals in 2021. He was on loan at Mineros last season, and Leo Flores, the central midfielder. Then Monagas, I think, have strengthened. They've kept hold of their key players. They've kept hold of Mickey Romero, David Martinez, obviously too young to leave anyway, and only 16. It seems crazy to describe him as a key player. And Federico Desante is coming to the fore, the 19-year-old striker. And they've added Luis Ruiz from UCV to the mix as well. And then I think rounding up my top 4 would be Deportivo La Guaira. They had a lot of players to replace. John Adam Buru left, obviously, in the summer of last year. Francisco Lamantia has signed in Lithuania. Carlos Olses is currently without a club, but has left, presumably with a new club in mind to go to. Giovanni Bolivar was signed by Albacete in the second division of Spain, third in the race for the Golden Boot last season. So plenty of goals to replace them. But they brought in Hernan Rivas, 33 years old, has scored goals in 9 different countries in the past 7 years, I found out earlier. His last 2 seasons in Liga FUTVE 7 years ago, both times over 15 goals, both with Deportivo Lara. They've got Tuti Andrade as a 10. They brought in Elias Romero to sit alongside Alex Flores. And they brought in Peralta from Monagas, Panamanian centre-back, who did very well with Monagas in the second half of last season. And Carlos Rojas, for example, who's currently doing well at left-sided centre-back for Venezuela's under-20s. It'll be interesting to see if he starts. That would be my roundup for the top 4. And I'm going to perhaps embarrass myself for a second year on the trot by yet again expecting Metropolitanos not to do as well. Last year, I said they finished 9th to 12th because I didn't know where the goals were coming from, and they ended up winning the league. This year, I've got them finishing in Sudamericana places, to be fair, not as low as last year, but I can't see them replicating a top 4. I don't think they've recruited enough strength and depth. We saw with La Guaira last season, and that was in the Sudamericana group stages, not Libertadores group stages, didn't pack their squad out with squad depth, which Deportivo Lara did. And although they didn't finish as high as they wanted to, they didn't finish in the top 4. They did get to the quarterfinals of the Sudamericana, and they certainly didn't embarrass themselves. Whereas La Guaira went the whole of Sudamericana and the time during that competition in the league without a win. Over 2 months, 11 league games without a win during the time they were in the Sudamericana. I'm not going to say it's going to be that bad for Metropolitanos, but I do think they're going to struggle to play Copa Libertadores group stage football and maintain a fight for the title or top 4 place in Liga FUTVE. Dominic, looking further down the table, because we pretty much agreed on the top 6 or 7. So looking towards the mid-table, who have you got in the mix, and how do you think, more importantly, the new boys are going to do? We've got 2 new teams to Liga FUTVE this season. Dominic, what can you tell us about them?
Yeah, we have Angostura who are promoted through winning the second division last year, and then we have, of course, Rayo Zuliano, who have replaced Zulia FC, and both are interesting projects. Both are bringing something interesting to the league. Rayo Zuliano, of course, are going to be, as many people know already, are inheriting a fair chunk of the Zulia FC roster. So there is going to be a fair bit of those players that you already know in the mix for them. They're certainly inheriting a solid chunk of really what was one of the better young cores in the league last year with Zulia. Some of these players are departing, but people like Simon Ramirez appear to be staying. Luis Pena, Custodio, a lot of talent, a lot of young talent that it'll be interesting to see if Rayo, with obviously a very resourced, well established organization, how they can use these players, how they can get the most out of them. I do suspect that they will struggle, in part because they are inheriting a roster that struggled last year, and so it's hard to assume that they'll suddenly somehow finish in 6th or something like that. I imagine that they will struggle. I don't necessarily think that they will get relegated, but I think that they will continue to when you're relying that much on young talent to be your veterans, I imagine that results in a season where you're going to have some rough periods. Angostura is a project I'm very interested in because this is a club that's waited a long time to get here. It's worth remembering that this is a club that's actually older in its current state than Metropolitanos, for example, and this is their first season in the league after many years of coming close in Liga FUTVE 2. And they made some interesting additions. They have some younger talent that I think is intriguing. They've brought in the Luis Gonzalez's, the Adrian Montanez from Zulia. They've brought some really senior pieces. They've brought sort of veteran defenders like Hener Gonzalez, who's kind of been working his craft in this league for multiple clubs, most recently Academia Puerto Cabello and Gran Valencia before that. And I'm curious to see how they can mix that together. Can they get these veteran defenders to continue to lead the line for another season, different city, different setting? And can they get the most out of these younger talents that, you know, are leaving maybe clubs that they didn't get the opportunities they needed at, and now this is a chance to sort of start at a younger club and make the most of it. I'm very curious to see how that works. Their preseason has been fantastic. As far as games that were made public that I'm aware of, they did not lose. They did draw and go to 2 penalty shootouts in a cup competition. Other than that, they have won every game. They've looked quite good against even the Metropolitanos and Hermanos Colmenares of the world. And yeah, so I'm very intrigued to see what they can pull off. And of course, they come into the league with maybe a chip on their shoulder in the sense that they've had to work a long time to get here, and now they have an opportunity to compete with local rivals like Mineros de Guyana for, you know, honors in the league. I suspect that they will do well, not necessarily competing for international competition well, but I would not be shocked if they finish somewhere between, say, 9th to 11th on the table. I think that they have the talent there. I think they've shown the competitiveness to do so. We've seen newly promoted teams in this league do even better than that. I don't think it's crazy to think that they might finish, say, 10th. And so I that's more or less where I put the two of the new clubs. Rayo, I think, will probably be somewhere below 12th. And Angostura, I'd put maybe somewhere around 9 or 10.
Okay, well, very similar to how I had it. Originally, I had both teams in the 9th to 12th bracket. I sort of divided the league into like who I think will finish top 4, who I think will finish in the next 4 places, so Sudamericana qualification, who will finish in the next 4 places, 9th to 12th, and then who will be scrapping it out as, like, you know, the bottom 3. And originally I had Rayo in that bottom 3, but UCV's recruitment, you know, supposed recruitment in the past 48 hours, that is how quickly they're putting a team together. And the fact that they have Edson Mencha Rodriguez in charge of the team again has sort of made me tempted to swap UCV out of a bottom 3 fight with Rayo, purely because, you know, Rayo, like you touched upon, they didn't win promotion from the 2nd division. And I know you watched a lot more of the 2nd division than I did last season, but, you know, the quality difference between Liga FUTVE and Liga FUTVE 2 is, in my opinion, you know, fairly considerable. And although they have inherited half of Zulia's squad, you know, Zulia did struggle at the first third and the last third of last season. It was only when they had Fran Perlo in the middle that they put together a decent run of results. And it was a very young squad, like you said, like, you know, essentially the hierarchy and the most experienced top division players that they're going to have are kids. So yeah, those two are tricky in my mind. I said off mic before we started the podcast that we are going to touch on the under-20 Sudamericano, which is underway. But before we get into that and we put a close to the preview section of the podcast, ending with a bit of fun, match week 1 fixtures. I have them in front of me, 7 games. I'm just going to go, Dominic, you versus I, and I'll make a note of it. And we'll publish who wins next week. See if I've got a pen. Here we go. Beautiful pink pen. Just a win, draw, or lose. No need for a score prediction. Caracas, Carabobo. Who are you going for?
Caracas.
Okay, Dominic goes Caracas for the first one. I'm going to go draw. Second game, Zamora Hermanos Colmenares, a Barinas derby.
Draw.
Okay, Dominic goes draw. I'm going to go Zamora win. Third game, a cross-city rivalry. Let's see how it develops in the next couple of years, if it's going to be a fully fledged rivalry or just like a cross-city derby. Angostura against Mineros, the new boys against the struggling to have a team boys.
I love Richard Blanco, but I think Angostura take this one. I think they're going to win. I think Angostura will win.
Okay, I'm going to go draw. We've not agreed so far, so hopefully we'll have a winner come Monday. La Guaira against Monagas. I'll pick first this time. I'm going to go draw.
You know what? We agreed. That has draw written all over it for me. Yeah, draw.
Okay, I've gone 3 draws so far. Metropolitanos against UCB. Again, not a fully fledged rivalry, a cross-city derby. Metropolitanos against UCB.
I have Metro on that one.
Yeah, same. We're agreeing on the last 2. And here, undoubtedly the biggest rivalry of match week 1, the Clásico Andino, Deportivo Táchira hosting Estudiantes de Mérida, one of the oldest rivalries in Venezuelan football.
I'm going to have to go with Táchira on that one.
Likewise, Estudiantes, although I do have a soft spot for them as a fellow red and white team with a lineage to Southampton, Táchira have had a strong window, big squad. Estudiantes, the exact opposite. And finally, kicking off at 7:30 Venezuelan time on Sunday night, Academia Puerto Cabello hosting Rayo Zuliano.
Academia, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we agree on that as well. So the difference is going to be those first 3 games, because we agree after that. So it's all coming down to Caracas Carabobo, Zamora Hermanas Comuneras, and Angostura Mineros. Let's see, come Monday morning, who gets most of match week 1 correct. We have just over 5 minutes left, and we are going to touch on the under-20 Sudamericano. We did a preview with a representative of all 10 countries, you, Dominic, representing Venezuela in a 2-part bumper opening episode of 2023. And we are now just over the midway point. The final stage has begun. The first phase is over. And Venezuela, after the worst start possible, losing 1-0 to Bolivia and then getting hammered by Uruguay, managed to turn it around with 2 victories and qualifying 2nd place for the final phase. How's it going, Dominic?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating tournament for sure. Like you said, a really worst nightmare possible start for Venezuela, but in the end, they get through, and it really, whatever it may have happened against Bolivia and Uruguay now, largely irrelevant in terms of the math of it all, because it's a clean start. They've drawn 1-1 with Paraguay in the first round of this final stage in a scrappy match that I'm not sure either country particularly thrived in. But it's not a horrible start for either, particularly because Ecuador and Colombia lost their opening games. I think that allows some room to breathe for Venezuela and Paraguay, who now are, I think, 3rd and 4th on the table for the night. I think there's a lot of hope still. I think that this team's going to be able to make something of this tournament after a really poor start. Obviously, 4 teams from these 6 get to move on to the World Cup, and really, aside from maybe Brazil, I think that these are all matches that are very approachable. It's been a crazy start. I think the one question mark that people will really have for this team still is getting those goals from open play, getting good moments from open play. Because right now it's really just been some good defending, good goalkeeping, and then obviously some good work around the box to earn some penalties that have been taken well by Alcocer. So, I think there's still questions about what this team can actually do with the ball. But in terms of getting through adversity and making something of the tournament, I think there's a lot of pride to be shown in the fact that they've made it as far as they have.
Yeah. So to run through the results, like I said, after the 2 opening defeats, it was 2 1-0 victories, both goals from the spot from Alcocer, as you alluded to, and then a 1-1 draw with Paraguay to kickstart the final phase. So we have another 4 games coming up in the form of, in no particular order, Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, and Colombia. And like you said, the top 4 qualify for the Under-20 World Cup, and the top 3 qualify for a South American Games kind of tournament later this year also. My problem with the first 2 games was Colaccini's team selection and formation. It was surprising. I know he wasn't in charge for the Toulon tournament where Venezuela finished runners-up back in June, but he was there, he was present, and 9 of these players are the same. But it was very strange. We had our most experienced defender by seasons played, René Rivas, a left-back, playing at centre-back. We had a centre-back playing at right-back who hadn't played any first-team football this season at all, in the form of Santiago Gomez. That has been addressed, but it took 2 games for it to be addressed. And then as we go further up the field, we've seen big name players sort of not deliver or not suit Colaccini's system so far. Yerson Chacon in particular, player of the year for Liga FUTVE in 2021, has debuted for the senior team. But he, as well as Andres Romero, have found themselves benched at various times in this tournament. And it's sort of lesser known names like Brian Alcocer and Luis Peña, who have been starting the games in which we've won and coming to the fore. Based on what you've seen in the tournament and based on what you've seen of these players in Liga FUTVE, where is their ceiling, this generation? How do you think it compares to the past two generations that have come before?
Well, that's a tough one. I think that the ceiling is quite high for this group. I think that for one reason or another, this tournament has started on a very strange foot. I will say that I actually really respect the decision after those first two games to essentially decide to just not worry about starting your stars and just focus on starting the guys that are playing well. I think that, in terms of doing what needs to get done in this tournament, and then if they make the World Cup thriving there, they're going to have to find a way to get these guys to perform well. They're going to need to find a way to get good minutes out of Carmona and Chacon and Romero and all these guys. That's going to be necessary, but it's hard to say what the ceiling is. I guess I think that there is as much talent in this group as there has been in any of these other groups. I think that what is clear is that it's become very difficult to mine that out of them. And I guess I don't know what the answers to those questions are. It seems like there's sort of progress being made there. Obviously, the results are coming in with some players. But yeah, it's a strange tournament in the sense that the guys that we thought the team would rely on the most are not playing anymore. And when they did, they didn't play particularly well. And it'll be interesting to see what they can do to improve that, because all these guys we're talking about that aren't performing are clearly very talented. They're easily some of the most talented players in the roster. They're some of the most talented players in the league as well. And so it's a little bit of a question mark, but I think that many of them have the same ceilings that the stars of those last two generations have.
Excellent. Well, we will probably, if not in an episode dedicated solely to the topic, we will definitely review the end result of this tournament. But that is all for today. I hope everyone listening have enjoyed this. And Dominic, thank you for being here as always.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Until next time, this is the FUTVE English Podcast. Goodbye.